So I'm going to jump into the meat of it because we have limited time, and I know a lot of people are curious about what you all are doing, what type of digital harms you all are combating, and what the scope of your team looks like. So my first question is going to be, like, what kind of powers do you have?
Well, listen, so we've been on a journey. We were established 9 years ago as the Children's eSafety Commissioner. And I can't remember if I told this story, but it came about because there was a well-known compere of Australia's Next Top Model who was very open about her mental health struggles. And she was very active on Twitter and was kind of doing all the wrong things. If you want to talk about social media self-defense, she was engaging, she was fighting, she wasn't blocking, and she had a nervous breakdown. Again, very public. She came back on. I saw some terrible, terrible tweets like, why don't you stick your head in an oven and finish the job? This is while I was interviewing at Twitter to open their Southeast Asian, Australian, New Zealand office. And she tragically took her life. That resulted in a petition that went to government that said, government needs to step in. There's just too much harm happening here. Now, the ICT minister at the time, his name was Malcolm Turnbull, was a barrister, but he was also a technology entrepreneur. So he knew that because of freedom of expression, they couldn't just go to an eSafety commissioner. We'd start with children. And so he took a bunch of functions that existed across government, the hotline that we already had to report child sexual exploitation material like NCMEC here in the United States, and some of the education programs. And the functions of the bill give me the role as the educator for online safety, as the national coordinator, and then as the regulator or protector. So when I joined, I was the second one. The first one was in the role for about 9 months. I sort of thought, gosh, there's something missing here. Yes, prevention. We want to stop the harms from happening in the first place. We need an evidence base. We need to co-design material. You know, we need to help parents, children, and teachers and carers to all know what the harms are and how to deal with them. I can walk through the protections. At the beginning, it was just a number of complaint schemes. And so the way that these work, they're all a little bit different. So we're a little bit of a Frankenstein, if you will. The first one was youth-based cyberbullying. So if a child was seriously threatened, harassed, humiliated, or threatened, and they report to a social media site and it doesn't come down, and that is a requirement of the legislation because the government didn't want to set us up as the content moderators of the internet. That is the job of the platforms themselves. But we serve as that safety net. And while people describe it as just taking down pieces of content, I don't see it that way. I see that as harms remediation. This is a child, and I can talk about the demographics, but since COVID, we're seeing a lot younger children who are 8 or 9 reporting pretty serious bullying. And I would describe the kind of behavior that we're seeing online by young people towards young people, because it's almost always peer-to-peer, as mercenary and merciless. So we've identified a practice called phoenixing, where one child will set up at least 60 accounts to target a single child, so each time it comes down, another one will rise in its ashes. So that's, and very persistent targeting. Even when children move cities, move schools, they'll find them online and continue to harass them. So I do have something called end user powers that I use very diligently. So to give you an example, there was a 14-year-old girl who was asked out on a date, and she said no. And so his 6 friends decided to avenge her and just piled on rape and death threats. And they were so seriously menacing that I decided to use this power in conjunction with the school principal and the parents, which it's essentially a cease and desist letter that comes from a government agency that says, 1, you need to take this down. 2, you need to write an apology letter to the victim survivor, and we're putting you on notice that we're watching. If you do this again, you know, we can penalize both the platforms, but also perpetrators and take them in for civil penalties or fines. So again, you use that very with a lot of discretion, but I do think a deterrent for the most egregious is important, because we don't want to be creating sociopaths that think that they can just
do whatever they
target
want.
people with impunity.
I think understanding how you all are defining harms versus how does Australia define it, are you seeing discrepancies of how different countries and regulators are defining harm? And is that impacting the way that there can be global governance or consensus around harm? First question. Second question is, you know, the situation with the young or the child that was being cyberbullied, and you all were able to use your BSI powers to identify who was on the other end. I feel like that's anomalous. Like, is it likely people are so good at hiding their identity online? Do you find that to be really difficult as well, to actually find the perpetrators on the other end? Is the second question. But the first one, like, let's talk about harms across the global scale and how people are defining it. How are you seeing it different?
So, I mean, being the first and for almost 7 years the only online harms regulator.
Period.
Yeah, well, we didn't have a comparator. And so when people, you know, tell me I'm part of the censorship industrial complex, I kind of remind them, because I go to WEF with Noam, and I'm a WEF trader, apparently. You know, I sort of point out that these were laws that were passed by the Parliament. And the huge difference that I see in discourse around online safety in the US Congress versus Parliament is that Australians across all political stripes definitely support freedom of expression, but they understand that when it veers into the lane of online discourse and is particularly targeting those who are vulnerable, it's silencing other voices. So each of the schemes have very well-defined thresholds for harm. So every time there's a report, we have to do an investigation. And sometimes people are surprised that they need, you know, evidence like a URL or a screenshot. But like the police, we need evidence so that this will hold up in court. And the other thing that's good about it, and a number of you are probably familiar with Murphy versus Missouri, when the US government was sort of informally asking the different platforms to take down COVID misinformation and that sort of thing. So we work towards thresholds of harm. We have to prove that it meets the threshold. But we have a range of different transparency and accountability mechanisms, so none of this is done kind of under the radar, even when we work informally with the platform. So we have a 90% success rate in terms of getting cyberbullying content down.
Wow.
And a 90% success rate in getting image-based abuse down, including deepfakes. So that's a pretty high strike rate, and that's where we do that delicate dance. Like, yeah, there's so much content happening here. The platforms don't want, you know, non-consensual nudes and kids being bullied on their platforms. So, you know, we keep that civility in working with them, and we explain very clearly why we think it violates their terms of service or why we think it violates the law. So we rarely have to use our formal powers with the more responsible platforms. But
which ones are responsible? Because I don't know.
I think they're, well, so, you know, they're the 10% of the platforms that don't respond to the image-based abuse sites, for instance, are what we call rogue porn sites or revenge porn sites that are set up for that purpose, where they will require you to actually pay to get your own intimate images down. There are also a number of sites that scrape this material, and they don't even have an administrator, which I think gives us a sort of view into like what regulation in a totally decentralized Web3 world might look like. I mean, notice and takedown may not be possible if it's, you know, sort of permanently lodged in a ledger somewhere. But people can challenge the decisions we take through an internal review, through what is called the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, through the Ombudsman, or take us to the federal court. And X-Corp's doing plenty of that right now, and it mostly has to do with trans individuals that have been terribly abused, that met the threshold of serious harm. So just to give you a sense, with the serious adult cyber abuse scheme, which is the newest one and the most controversial, the threshold is set higher. So my investigators have to prove that there was serious intent to harm and that it was menacing, harassing, and offensive to an ordinary, reasonable person, which is a very high bar. It can't just be mere emotional distress. So only about 6% of those reports that are actually actioned with formal removal powers.
You mentioned the adult cyber abuse scheme, which was going to run into my next question, and you spoke about the thresholds. Do you mind quantifying the amount of requests that you all get, as well as some of these tricky trade-offs? So, for example, when content is being flagged as abusive, could it potentially also be of public interest? And if that's the case, have you run into situations like that where you guys have flagged something as abusive, but then maybe a research group has said, like, no, we need that content available?
No, because this isn't about stuff that's controversial. There's specific carve-outs or exemptions for political content and for journalistic content, so that we don't, and it's higher than the threshold of defamation, which has actually, that's been one of the hardest things for our investigators. People get really angry because they're hurt. They feel like they are being harmed, and that it's beyond, and defamation is about harm to reputation, but it's not as high as the threshold for adult cyber abuse. So when we say it doesn't meet the threshold, but you can do this, we can informally try and do this, but if we're not successful, then you're going to need to lawyer and to go to court. People get unhappy and they abuse our investigators, and I'm sure those of you who've worked in trust and safety have sort of had that response before, when people are just so frustrated. Again, we try and provide whatever guidance we can. But just to give you an example, last year, in the context of technology-facilitated gender-based violence, we probably took about 13,000 cases just from women and girls that dealt with coercive control, cyber stalking, doxing, and image-based abuse as a form of relationship retribution.
You'd mentioned there were 13,000, I think, requests or reports that you saw. How are you all evangelizing the fact that this exists? I mean, I feel like that's one of the biggest problems, that we have solutions, but it's not getting to the communities that need them. Are you guys doing social media content, or how is it happening?
There's about a 34% awareness rate that we exist, and that has all been through social media and print and occasionally being on the news. When the Prime Minister mentions eSafety, we usually get a huge spike, which is great. So we try and get in his ear.
What's something that you hope that people in this room can take away tangibly to do to help your movement?
Well, I really strongly believe that we've developed a good model that balances a whole range of rights, and that is through the 4 Ps of prevention, protection, and then proactive and systemic change, and that's all underpinned by partnerships. I also like to say that you can have light touch legislation and regulation that doesn't undermine innovation. In fact, I'd like to see us turn these discussions on their head. I'd like to see more innovation put into safety and safety by design, and AI is a perfect use case for that.